What's up?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Today, we have another session of our book launch seminars at the HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. My name is Aziza Mustafa. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at HUMA. And so today, our book that we are going to launch, and we are very, very grateful to have you here, Professor Sackeyfio. It's really a pleasure. The book title is Western African Women in the Diaspora: Narratives of Other Spaces, Other Selves. I'm not going to talk much about the book. We are going to hear about it in a second. Let me introduce Professor Sackeyfio. Professor Sackeyfio, she has taught at the Department of Liberal Studies and English at Winston-Salem State University for almost 3 decades. Her research and teaching are situated at the nexus of interdisciplinary scholarship on literatures of African and African diaspora women, women's studies, cultural studies, and recently, South Asian women's writing. Her research interests evolved from over 40 years of travel and research in Western Africa, and her publications and scholarly pursuits explore various aspects of the lives of African and African diaspora women in the global arena. Beside the book we are going to have today, she is also the editor of a volume of critical essays, Women Writing Diaspora in the 21st Century, and a co-editor of a collection of critical essays, Emerging Perspectives on Akishi Adimora Izipu. Her other publications include many book chapters in edited collections and peer-reviewed articles in leading journals like African Literature Today and the Journal of African Literature Association. Professor Sackeyfio's current research examines the experiences of African female students in China and constitutes a large project on the ways in which African women in China have negotiated gender spaces with the context of globalization. She also has a current book project, which is titled African Women Narrating Identity, Local and Global Journeys of the Self. Welcome, Professor Sackeyfio. We also have another very prominent, and we are looking forward to the discussion that will be held by Professor Helenita, who is a full professor of English since 2019. And she's the Dean of the School of Language at the University of Ghana. She is the former head of the Department of English and founding director of the University of Ghana Karingi Writing Center. She's also the head of the Writing Support Unit of University of Ghana Center for Teaching, Learning, Innovation. She's also a literary scholar and a cultural critic. She has published on gender identity in literature, particularly oral and written African literature, African American and immigrant American literature, children's literature in Ghana, and women's cultural production in colonial and contemporary Africa. Her publications appear in leading journals, including Research in African Literature, Oral Traditions, Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, Fabiola, Children's Literatures Association Quarterly, South Quarterly, African Literature Today, Journal of Postcolonial Writing, and the Journal of African Cultural Studies. Her most recent work as an editor includes After the Ceremonies, new and selected poems by Ama-Ata Iedo, and also The Philosophical Foundation of the African Humanities Through the Postcolonial Perspectives, and The Radio, a platform for creative writing, Ghanaian literature, and the broadcast culture. She also has a special issue of Obsidian, Literature and the Arts in the African Diaspora, And she's working currently on the book projects, including Knowing African Women, Critical Perspectives of Rural Women's Oral Poetry, and Women of Africa, the autobiography of Mabel Dove Dangwa. Welcome, Professor Helenita. Now I will give the floor for Professor Sackeyfio. The structure of the presentation today will be 20 minutes presentation on the book. Then we will have 10 to 15 minutes discussion. And after that, I will open the floor for questions, remarks from the audience. Once again, without further ado, Professor Sackeyfio, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon to all of you. It is quite an honor to be here to exchange ideas with you. I would like to begin by thanking your director, Professor Divine Few, and the hard work that all of you committed to making this event possible, especially to Amina. It's not easy, and these are difficult times. I am honored and I appreciate all of you in this effort. I would also like to thank and acknowledge my colleague, my esteemed colleague, Professor Helenita, for agreeing to be a part of this, to be a discussant. She is incredible, and it is quite pleasing to have her join us. And I'm looking forward to the exchange of ideas. And I especially appreciate the opportunity for scholars of color to engage across continents. I've been not that long ago, I've been to Johannesburg twice. This is like my third visit, a virtual visit, but I'm very pleased at this forum, this platform for us to exchange ideas. So thank all of you. I'm thanking everyone. To begin, I'm going to, in 20 minutes, I'm going to introduce the book in terms of the chapters, the conceptual framework, issues explored, and I am, well, let me just begin. The book is West African Women Writing Diaspora, Narratives of Other Spaces, Other Selves, and the collection of critical essays in the work examines the complexities of transnational identities among African women. Diaspora themes take center stage in ways that reposition women's experiences in African literary expression. The volume reclaims women's voices from the margins of African literary history and project diverse representations of women's experiences in the African diaspora. By foregrounding women's perspectives, the chapters represent the evolution of female-centered writing that has shifted the direction of the African novel in the 21st century. The book is, I hope, a meaningful contribution to literary criticism through analysis of women's writing in a single volume that highlights the intersection of race, class, and gender in the lives of African migrant women. West African Women in the Diaspora, Narratives of Other Spaces, Other Selves is, I hope, that it will be an invaluable resource for scholars, researchers, and students of African women's writing in the global age. And to continue, the timeliness of this volume amplifies the production of African women's immigrant writing that began in the mid-1970s. So what I'm also doing in the way that the chapters are structured is that it is kind of a chronological timeline. I open the volume with two iconic women writers who are both the first African women to write about the diaspora. And the first is Emma Cheta as one of the forerunners. Ama Ata Edu is the other. So beginning with Emma Cheta's London novels, 1972, In the Ditch, Second Class Citizen, 1974, Well, these are her first two books from the diaspora. She has others from the diaspora, but in my work, in my introduction, and in the first chapter, I'm focusing only on those two works. Kehinde, 1994, and in 2000, The New Tribe, represent diaspora perspectives on women's experiences. And then writing later in the 1970s, 1977, Ama Ata and crafted Our Sister Killjoy, 1977, so that both of these, all of these works during the 70s lay the groundwork for African women's literature in the global age. To continue, the early narratives of immigrant women's lives pushed the boundaries away from stereotypical images of women in male authored works that began in the mid-1950s with male forerunners, first generation male writers like Achebe, Soyinka, and a number of others. Things Fall Apart, Soyinka's Lion and the Jewel. Those are vivid examples, but there are other examples of women's images in these works. Cyprian Ekwensi's Jagwa Nana's daughter, and so on. Those are other examples. Since the turn of the century, a contemporary generation of women writers have transformed this chronological timeline, transformed the literary canon through interrogation of an eclectic array of arresting themes that encompass post-colonial perspectives, feminist expression, and to some degree, Afropolitan sentiments, and broadly, women's identity. Moreover, local and global tensions and the vagaries of life in diaspora settings, most notably cultural hybridity, are reoccurring tropes in this growing body of works in the 21st century. The ways in which migrant women navigate these complexities is the focal point of my work. The global age ushered massive movement of diverse African populations across national borders, making transcultural spaces new sites of ethnic, linguistic, and cultural encounters. In 2004, I'm mentioning here just 2 or 3 critics. There are many, many others, but in 2004, Ernest Imenyo, editor of New Women's Writing in African Literature, this is ALT, African Literature Today, number 24, noted the increasing presence of African women onto the literary stage. His edited volume, his editorial, New Women's Writing, A Phenomenal Rise, frames what I am doing also, lauds the development of women's fiction in the late 20th century into the global age. As one of the leading journals of African literature, that publication has devoted a number of volumes in the 21st century dedicated to the development of African women's voices on the continent, as well as an important focus on immigrant fiction. I'm just going to mention 2 other critics. There are many others. Abiola Irele, 2009. You know that he's had passed on now, one of our greatest African literary critics. Chris Abani, 2014, Mukoma Wat and Ngugi, 2018, have added their voices to celebrate the new trajectories of 3rd generation African women's writing. So we see that with all of this attention, the award-winning writing, and just the proliferation of African women's writing, we see that African women's artistry has come full circle to represent a constellation of gendered fictional accounts of self-discovery, relationships to Africa, and the interrogation of Western perceptions of the African self. Ato Quayson also notes, and I quote, "The emphasis in the most widely read new African writers is now no longer what happens to the African located in Africa, but what happens to the African resident in London, New York, Edinburgh, Berlin, or Rome, who keeps dreaming nostalgically of Africa, unquote. The chapters in my volume address a broad range of themes, such as hybrid identities, marginalized status, and women's subjectivity beyond Africa's borders. West Africa claims the spotlight of the volume, Ghana and Nigeria, to feature writers from those two countries. And in Anglophone literary history, Nigeria does feature prominently. Over several decades, Nigerian writers, I'm just giving a broad overview of both countries. Nigerian writers have created a prolific outpouring of works that may be juxtaposed with the preeminence of contemporary works by Nigerian writers. The ones in my volume are Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Sefi Ata, Chika Unigwe, who carry the legacy of Emecheta and Flora Nwapa from the early post-independence era into the global age. Likewise, Ghanaian writers have also made their profound mark in West African literary traditions through significant post-colonial works by Ayikwe Armah, Kofi Awunur, Ni Ayi Parks, Benjamin Kwache. So those are both older and contemporary writers, the last two contemporary among others, along with Benjamin Kwache. Important Ghanaian women writers, as we know, Efua Sutherland, Ama Ata, Ama Darko, Abena Busia, the poet, notably successful contemporary writers. It's growing. Tai Selassie has a dual heritage from Nigeria and Ghana, but I have included her. Yajiasi, Nana Oforiata Ayim, and very recently, Peace Adzo Mehdi in His Only Wife. In the same way as third generation writers from Nigeria, Diaspora Themes command center stage to mirror global mobility of African women as they encounter, again, the intersection of race, class, and gender in Western spaces. New avenues of mobility emerge in an interconnected world when African subjects traverse national, religious, and geographical and linguistic borders. As first generation authors, the novels of Emecheta and Edu represent conventional post-colonial themes that investigate the nation state, national identity, neo-colonialism, and the problematic behaviors of Africans at home and abroad through the lens of gender. Contemporary writers in the book reimagine these themes and challenges through looking at paradoxical behaviors and contradictions that emerge in foreign lands. How much time do I have? I'm looking. How much time do I have? Then I'll go on. I want to say that contemporary writers are, well, post-colonial synergy flows through all of the fiction in the volume as a nexus of African immigrant dynamics that reconfigure women's identities. The works that are explored in my book explicate local and global relationships as these determine women's outcomes in Africa as well as when they journey abroad. So I'm going to very, very quickly, because I know that I perhaps am going over. I'm going to just give a very, very brief description of each of the chapters. There are 8 chapters in the volume, an introduction and a conclusion. Chapter 1, as I said before, opens with Emecheta from 1972 and 1974. These 2 novels may be interpreted as women's historical fiction through authentic portrayal of the struggle for self-realization of a Nigerian woman in London. Chapter 2 investigates Our Sister Killjoy as a post-colonial and feminist classic that illuminates the challenges of Ghanaian immigrants, primarily in Germany, but also in London. This chapter engages the protagonist's perspectives on the colonial project, neo-colonial realities, and the African experience of hybridity. And through her sharp critique, the central character, Sisi, responds to a broad range of problems in Europe, such as racial difference, the behavior of her fellow Ghanaians, and their refusal to return to Ghana. And post-colonial perspectives are sharply etched in the chapter through examination of hegemonic discourses that frame the colonial encounter in the past. Chapter 3 is on is called Chika Unigwe's on Black Sister Street. The chapter is called Violated Bodies and Displaced Identities. It's explored in this chapter that describes sex trafficking between Nigeria and Belgium. This chapter foregrounds women's vulnerability in patriarchal societies that control women's labor and sexuality in Africa and abroad through the international sex industry. The 4 women profiled in this work are essentially sex slaves, and the relationship of trafficking to the Atlantic slave trade is highlighted in the chapter. Chapter 4 examines Adichie's Americana. It is called Negotiating Identity and Pan-African Aesthetics. In Americana, Adichie's exploration of race, identity, and Pan-Africanism represents a conceptual framework. In 2006, an African-American scholar, Crystal Temple, formulated a theoretical construction of literary Pan-Africanism, which is the lens through which I look at her work. Chapter 5, back to Ama Ata in her 2012 collection of short stories about Ghanaian women who've been in London for decades. That chapter is called Reimagining Homeland and Mirrors of the Past. A post-colonial framework accentuates themes of fragmentation, incongruence, and crisis of identity. Essentially, none of the women in most of those stories, there are 11 of them, want to go back to Ghana. Chapter 6, Unbecoming Dreams, Splintered Identities and Routes of Return in Selassie's Ghana Must Go. It illuminates the complexities of transnational experiences that spans America, Ghana, and Nigeria. The hyphenated lives and splintered dreams of the Sai family wreak emotional havoc, while hybridity and unresolved issues define their identity. Chapter 7 explores diaspora perspectives this is short fiction. It is called Transnational Gazing and Shifting Identities in Short Fiction by Sefi Atta and Adichie. The short story genre is a fictional landscape to engage again complexities of hybridized existence. There are 3 short stories on Monday of last week about a woman coming from Nigeria with unrealistic expectations, a temporary position by Adichie, contrast a woman in London who is torn between going home or staying in London. Her life is uncomfortable and paradoxical. News from Home is like a novella by Sefi Atta, and it skillfully highlights the effects of environmental degradation and crippling poverty in the Niger Delta through a feminist lens. So basically the protagonist is from the Niger Delta. She comes to New Jersey, she's working for a family. On the news, she sees the women in her community protesting the extractive oil industry by multinational oil companies. So that's why that chapter is called, well, not the chapter, my analysis, Transnational Gazing. And finally, chapter 8, There's No Place Like Home, Memory and Identity in Sefi Atta's A Bit of Difference, about a woman in London. Her family wants her to come home, get married, have children, and she's again in this hybrid state where she doesn't know what she wants to do. Fortunately, she ends up going back home. So I think I am done. I am. And I hope that that did not go over.
No, thank you very much. You're actually perfectly on time. Huh?
Well, I kind of timed it. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Now I invite Professor Helen Ita for the discussion. The floor is yours. Professor Helen. Okay.
Thank you.
Professor Helen, can you hear us? I think she disappeared.
I'm sure she'll be back.
Okay. Then until she's back, we could actually spice the discussion. And I'm really fascinated by the book, and I mean, I just also read the first chapter, the bits and parts that I could find on the internet, and I like the idea of how the book, it is titled West African Diaspora Literature, but it actually transcends to the African literature, the African diaspora literature. And I would like to just ask, so I mean, you know, like the region of West Africa is already big. So how, yes, so in what kind of capacity, and how this fictions from Ghana and from Nigeria actually transcends to the whole African continent, or the whole African diaspora literature?
Well, it's not intended to. I have this one is
Please pardon me. I think I'm having internet.
Professor Ita, you are muted. Let me unmute her.
Sorry, I said I had internet challenges, and so I was signed out automatically when the power went off.
Okay.
So sorry about that, but it's part of what we deal with.
Yes.
Here.
Okay, then yeah, we can postpone my question, and then we could proceed with the discussion, and we come back to my question. Please.
Pardon?
No, we started already a kind of discussion, a question, but until we were waiting until you're coming back. But now, since you are back, we'll go and proceed with the discussion. So please, the floor is yours.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Before I get tuned out again. Yeah. So it's a delight to be here to join this discussion for Professor Sackeyfio's book launch. For the book titled West African Women in the Diaspora, Narratives of Other Spaces, Other Selves. I think that, you know, for me, this book places a searchlight on the subject of West African women writers in the diaspora. And this should be of keen interest to scholars who work in this area and in African literature in general. The book deals with women authors who engage a range of interrelated themes, all related to life in the diaspora, including post-colonial feminist and Pan-African themes, among others, while also keeping their focus on their African origins and the challenges that characterize these origins, such as ineffective leadership in African nations, political corruption, economic dysfunction, marginalized women in our communities, and so on, class dynamics. So in effect, Sackeyfio celebrates the glaring celebrity of these West African women as writers who function as front runners, forerunners, people who can put on the table for us a series of issues which contemporary women can deal with and continue to deal with. We encounter protagonists who experience the kind of situation that Salman Rushdie in a 1984 essay on Gunta Grass calls a triple disruption. A disruption from place, a disruption from language, and a disruption from the social environment. Professor Sackeyfio looks at these issues through the lens of theoretical concepts like Afropolitanism, feminism, and the diaspora perspective, and looks at these from diasporan perspectives. And I like the fact that she subjects these theoretical concepts to scrutiny. For example, with Afropolitanism, she states that her aim is to avoid the pitfalls of essentialism that this term calls up. And she does this by passing out Afropolitan elements as a route to interrogating existential conditions and the ways in which women renegotiate identities in diverse locales of the African diaspora. And this is very important because when we think about Afropolitanism, for example, what comes to mind is, for example, Trey Ellis's The New Black Aesthetic. I think it was published in, is it 1989 or something like that? And I'm looking at, for example, questions of essentialist leanings that were, I should say criticisms about essentialist leanings that were leveled against this concept, the new Black aesthetic. And I can see similar attitudes towards Afropolitanism. And so what I'm saying is that for me, it is refreshing that Professor Sackeyfio does not take this concept and some of the others that she works with, she doesn't take them at face value, but closely examines them to distill from them the elements that she thinks can best help her to present her case about these writers and their books. Another concept that I see that is of interest is class. And of course, we also know about race. But I should like to point out that, when it comes to class, I would have liked to see a similar critique because in the West African context, class is not simply a question of material wealth, but it's more importantly about social wealth pertaining to honor, respect, and integrity. And I see this attitude towards class, for example, in Chike Onigwe's book, where you have these women, the Black sisters, you know, in a situation where they are between thinking about their own safety and thinking about the dehumanization that is they are confronted with. So in all, I have gained a lot from reading this book. What happens to African women in London and what happens to them in America, and the different strands of selves that being in these spaces generates. The main task for us as literary critics is to continue to build on what has been laid down. Because as Professor Sackeyfio rightly says, the portrayal of women characters in these works, in some of the early works, paved the way for feminist expression in subsequent works by African women. And therefore, this work is important in the steps that Professor Sackeyfio has taken to build on this tradition of feminist expression in writing by African women. So one would like to see how this book builds on this earlier tradition. But in doing so, there are some considerations that I think would also help make it clear what is being built upon and how this is being done. And I'll just touch on a few things. One, in talking about works that define the genre from the colonial era to the post-independence period, the history of West African women writers in and about the diaspora needs to be more fully accounted for. I think, for example, about Adelaide Casely Hayford, 1868 to 1960, whose own identity as a Black British African woman, a Black British / African woman, a Black nationalist, feminist, and fiction writer who lived on 2 continents, Africa and Europe, and spent years in the US. And her life and work should place her squarely within this group of diasporan West African women writers. She wrote about and even staged performances abroad, notably in the US, about slavery and the lives of Africans in the New World. Likewise, her daughter Gladys Casely Hayford, 1904 to 1950, born in Ghana, lived a significant part of her life in Europe, was a renowned poet, and her work, widely anthologized, was loved by writers from the Harlem Renaissance, among others. We could also think of Mabel Davdankwa, 1905 to 1984, feminist, journalist, fiction writer, and political activist. Edu's Our Sister Killjoy, it's one of the texts dealt with here. And I've always been fascinated by this book and the variety of dimensions, critical dimensions that it lends itself to. And I think that this book could also be looked at against Edu's earlier works, such as Dilemma of a Ghost, 1965, where she began exploring the diaspora experience, the Africans' experience in the diaspora, and the African Americans' experience in Africa, rather than just as a novel that contributes to Emecheta's works that chronicle diaspora journeys for African female migrants. The critical tradition also, has been captured very impressively in this book. But I also would have liked to see some like Nambika, one of the earliest studies by Carol Davis and Ann Adams, which laid the foundation for reading African women writers. The last thing I'll touch on is the question of migration in West African literature. Again, I have to say I was very drawn in by the extensive coverage that Professor Sackeyfio has done in this very short book from migration between Nigeria, Ghana, and Britain, to migration from Africa to the US and so on, and all the other challenges and transformations that happen in between. But also from a literary historical perspective, when it comes to the subject of migration in West African fiction of both men and women, one needs to take into account and build upon earlier traditions like the Bintu phenomenon. Works in this tradition typically portray Africans who, like Sisi in Amataidu's Our Sister Killjoy, travel abroad for further education or jobs where they are alienated, disillusioned, and yet nostalgically attached to the country of their origin and youth. So it would be interesting to see how the Bintu who went abroad in search of the trophies of Europe or the West, and by trophies, I mean education, wealth, and status, to see how this Bintu has transformed into the non-returning migrants that Professor Sackeyfio identifies in the works selected for study in this book. People who migrate, who now migrate in search of education, employment opportunities, and greener pastures abroad. It's also important to note that it's not only the written literary tradition that has championed the course that the West African women novelists of the 21st century are pursuing, but that other genres like oral performance feed into the written tradition that is being discussed in this book. And also the work of women historians and so on and so on. And I think that among all of these, there is definitely some cross fertilization. In concluding, I'd like to say that Professor Sackeyfio's book brings to the field of African literature, West African literature, and diasporan West African literature by women. She brings to it a keenness of sensitivity to the issues that these women, and particularly their characters as a group, are grappling with. Issues that emanate from their their identities or their statuses as post-colonial diasporan migrants who are in a situation where they are marginal characters despite their economic, educational, and other successes. This is certainly a book that we as scholars and critics of African literature can benefit a lot from. And I look forward to seeing the very, interesting discussion, very stimulated discussion that this book will generate in the coming months and years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ita. It was a really, really rich coverage of the book. It's a rich discussion. It's opening a lot of like venues for thinking and rethinking, especially African diaspora literature. But so Professor Sackeyfio, do you have any response for the Professor Ita before we open the discussion for the floor?
No, I would like to thank her for those wonderful, insightful comments that broadened. That's what scholars and critics do. We highlight, we extend themes, we make, we elaborate on what we see might have been included. We broaden the perspective on the analysis, the interpretation, the scope of the work, and the, how can I put it, the leading features of the work. So I would like to commend my colleague and sister for her comments. I can only say that that no book can do, you know that when we critique publications, there is always room for, well, you could have had a chapter on this, or you might have, so all of that is taken in a positive spirit. I am engaged in other writing in terms of those. Dr. Professor Ita partly answered your question about why, one, I'm a West Africanist. I'm a West Africanist. The fourth book that I'm working on is
that's a term that I'm just hearing about today.
West Africanist.
Yes, because of the complexity of Africa, Africa's diversity. We have North African literature, West African. Yes, so there are specialists. Yes. And I will never claim to be a specialist on all of them. However, in my fourth book, that is a book that Professor Ita may find very interesting. I'm covering North, South, East, and West. And part one is women writing from the continent. And then part two is women from those same four regions, a representative writer from each region writing from the diaspora. That's what I'm working on now. And that should make you very happy, Dr.
Of course, no book can present you are right about that. No book can present a very comprehensive coverage of all the issues.
Yeah, So please know that,
and especially in a short book, such as this one.
Yeah, it is a short book. And also for this one that also came out in April is broad, is also broad in terms of regional diversity. So all of your points, Professor Ita, are well taken. I don't have any problem with it. The only one I might want to comment on, and by the way, I teach a course on women's writing in a global context, and I have a unit on African women's writing, and I teach Anawa and Dilemma of a Ghost. I think that you mentioned the part about the African American ukulele in that work. I'm not sure that work, that I would treat that in a diaspora, unless I had a theme, an overarching theme like return home, or I made some kind of intersectional connection between people from the diaspora who go back, and then African women or characters who leave. That would be a way to have worked something like that in. But I love that work. I teach it. And interestingly, when I teach it, I use that work, Dilemma of a Ghost, to introduce the difficult relationship between Ghana and the diaspora. I do a lot with that work. It's one of my favorite works. And even though it's an older work from 1965, I frame the issues in it to allow my students to make a connection, a 21st century connection, if you will, to some of the tensions between Ghana and the diaspora. And I introduce the year of return, and I do it in very, very complex ways. But thank you for those amazing compliments. And I jotted them down for my next work.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to, there's some questions in the chat. The first one is from our director, Divine Fu. Is Afropolitanism Africa's next big dilemma, especially given that some of us left home on some of the plundered wealth of elites, and the ways in which people like myself have become the lens through which we read the continent? So
the question is Afropolitan African dilemma?
Yes, yes.
It's such a controversial subject. And as everybody knows, the person who popularized it, people say that she was not the first, number one. Secondly, everyone knows that it's a combination of African and cosmopolitan. So yes, we would obviously agree that such a person or such personalities exist, is Africans who migrate and who are indeed cosmopolitan in that broad sense. But the problem with the term that a number of critics have brought out is that it is essentialist. Because then what happens, we don't address the masses who may not, because of wealth, and like Professor Yita said, privilege and class, may not exhibit the class dynamics to enter spaces where they become successful and really rise to the top and have mobility and opportunity and success. And they basically move seamlessly in and out of these transnational spaces. That cannot be said for the masses. And we have some of the most dramatic, how can I put it, critiques are the thousands who die in the Mediterranean trying to get across. You have people who are undocumented, masses of people who are undocumented. Okay, Ndibe, oh my God, have you all read Foreign Gods, about the guy in New York, the Nigerian who graduated at the top of his class, and he's like driving a taxi. He has a bachelor's degree. There are zillions of stories like that of people whose dreams are failed. So this is the problem with the term, is that not that there are not people who embody the core of the concept, is these mobile, successful, brilliant Africans who speak languages, and like Selassie herself, have multiple locales which they can call home. There are people, even in my circle, I know of people who fall, I'm talking about immigrants, who fall through the cracks. So we cannot create a term that lumps everyone together. I think, I'm trying to remember who said it. Was it Achille Mbembe or was it Simon Gikandi? I think it was Gikandi who said that the best thing that we can get from the term is that it usurps the other trope, the stereotype of the abject immigrant, to show that there are other ways of being African in the world, in a globalized world. So we don't want stereotypes of either kind. But I think the question kind of answers itself. The endless debates about this. And then the one more thing I wanted to say about it, one of the problems with the term is that it has been commodified so that you have fashion, and then you have visible, how can I put it, kind of popularized clothing and fashion, and just a kind of, I don't know how to put it, commodification of the term that is, how can I put it? I won't use the word rip off, but it's a kind of misleading emphasis. So those are my comments. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great, I knew that that question would come. It always comes up in discussions like this. And well, I do have one more thing to add. When I looked at Ghana Must Go, I kind of raised the issues that I very briefly summarized about the characters, the Sai family. Are they or are they not? And they obviously, they fit partly into it, but if you look at what happens to them, the father especially, and his failed dreams of being a doctor, and he leaves America. So that's how I didn't use it in each chapter of my book, but I used it more prominently in Ghana Must Go when I looked at that chapter. But thank you for that great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a hand raised by my colleague Mimi. We'll take Mimi's question, and then there's another question from our from Carly Kotze, our fan. And yes, so I don't know, we'll take Mimi first, and then we'll take Carly. Yeah. Mimi, please.
Thank you, Azza. Thank you, professors, for sharing your wonderful scholarship with us. Highly appreciated. I really appreciate the breadth of your scholarship, especially because I'm not very well not as conversant as you are, obviously, in this topic. But although that's the case, I have a question on the notion of diaspora and what it really means, because I've had a recent growing, let's say, maybe an obsession about borders on the continent, and there's a tendency, or maybe there's a generalization to say that the diaspora refers to a world outside the continent. But I mean, with a continent with so many borders and so many democracies and so many different types of spaces, couldn't diaspora mean a country that is outside your own, but within Africa? That's something I've been wondering. Could it include that as opposed to just outside Africa, given the differences that exist in the continent? And I say this especially because people that are less familiar with Africa, especially those that have never been to the continent, they have a tendency to think Africa is just one big country, but there's so many different places. And Africans themselves, can they imagine that, can I as a Zimbabwean, can I imagine that the diaspora is South Africa? Can I imagine that diaspora is Zambia? I've never been to Zambia, mostly because of these borders. And also, yeah, that's the question, part A. Part B, I'm not sure if I remember part B of the question, but let me just pause and remember what part B of my question is.
While I answer part A.
Yes, yeah.
You're absolutely right. And that points to another point that Professor Yita mentioned, is migration. You know what comes to mind when I think of that is Bessie Head and her work. And when she went to Botswana and was an outsider. Yeah, so obviously the term has broad significance. And obviously there is also a body of literature on, how can I call it, intra-Africa migration, and what those, how can I put it, how those dynamics, how characters or people navigate those dynamics. There are, oh my goodness, it's a trope in literature in a very broad sense. These days, because of global movement, we immediately think of outside the continent. And this body of literature speaks to that. But you've made an excellent point, which is, by the way, another book, is migration. It is another book.
Okay.
So it's not meant to be a conflictual framing. It just means that in the sense in which I treat it, and the authors that I'm looking at, they are writing from the West about the West, especially the racial dynamics. So yes, we have inter-African or ethnic politics, identity formation, conflicts, problems, difference, exclusion, and so on within the borders of the continent. So I thank you for that content, that comment.
Yeah, and
Okay.
well, I guess perhaps having said that, maybe part B of my question could just be a comment. I was just thinking even beyond the scope of your current presentation on how we could potentially think about these different representations coming from different territories in Africa, how they play out outside the continent in different countries. How do people experience the diaspora outside Africa as a Nigerian or as a Zimbabwean or as a South African? Of course, that's another conversation, but yeah, thank you for that, Prof.
Okay, and no, I thank you for those comments. They are very well taken. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we go to the chat and I'll read Carla's question. She says, I am interested in how gender and diaspora are overlaid in this book, but also more generally, and wonder what the work is of gender. In other words, how are diasporic identities indexed differently in the work by authors with a range of gender orientations? So
let me start with the last. Gender orientations is not specifically a theme within my work, but gender comes into play in terms of patriarchy and the forces that operate that are gender specific, that drive the characters into these uncomfortable spaces. On Black Sister Street is a very good example. I highlight the fact that women, because of male dominance, are driven into these uncomfortable spaces and end up in the hands of traffickers. If we look at our sister Killjoy, she points out all of her dialogues with men in the work. It highlights gender. In Emma Cheta's chapter, we look at her treatment. Actually, I have a couple of excerpts in that chapter about how her husband, after he burnt her first manuscript, remember, I'm trying to remember the quote, remember that you are a woman and that you're Black. And you're basically, I'm summarizing the quote, that you're basically nothing here. So it's a theme that is interconnected in, I think, pretty much all of the, perhaps maybe not so much in Ghana Must Go, but in most of the works, and perhaps not so much in Diplomatic Pounds, because that's basically about women, Ghanaian women who've been in London for so long, and then when they come back, they don't fit, they don't like it, they're thinking English in their heads, they don't relate to their families. So what I would like to say in summary is that in some of the works, it is highlighted in more than in others, but not in every single work. But gender is a very important theme, gender, class, and race.
Thank you very much, Professor Sackeyfio and Professor Ita. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of the session. Yes, we hope that you will visit us again in Huma. We'll have more discussions, especially about the new coming books that will be like more and broadly about issues of diaspora, African literature from different parts of Africa. And we're very interested on that book. So yes, we are hoping that you will come back again. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here and for being patient. And yes, so I think this is the end of our session.
Oh,
yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank all of you. If anyone wants
Thank you
to ask
for having us.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Write me if you have other questions. Please write.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Yes, yes.
Yeah,
We
and
will share.
will I get a recording?
Yes, I think